Now live. I'm just going to give it a few seconds to allow participants to join. So give me a moment and then we will start properly. As you're coming into the room, just to let you know, we're giving the opportunity for people to come in from the waiting area. So the numbers are just going up now in terms of participants, and we will start very shortly. Okay, I think we've given everybody a chance to get in. Hello, everybody, wherever you are in the world. It's afternoon here in the UK, but maybe morning where you are. My name is Barbara Armstrong from MSD UK, and welcome to this very exciting session. I'm very much looking forward to this. I think this is going to, well, they've all been good, but I think this is going to be a particularly good one. My role today is very straightforward. I am going to introduce our speaker and also manage the Q&A at the end. So I have a very straightforward task. So let me introduce you, please, to Sabre Collier. She helps to build entrepreneurial ecosystems all over the world. And she, from delivering fundraising strategies to agricultural cooperatives in places like Angola, to helping Arabian Gulf governments launch startup investment funds, she has dedicated most of her adult life to catalyzing entrepreneurship, especially to growing enterprises in emerging markets and, which is very interesting for us here today, underserved communities in the US. So we are very excited and very much looking forward to hearing this talk today. And there'll be no PowerPoint presentation. It'll be a straightforward talk, and then there will be followed by Q&A. So if I could ask you please to use the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will come back to questions after Tara has finished her presentation. So we're looking forward to this, Tara. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. As Barbara kindly alluded to, I have a long background at the intersection of impact investing, economic development, and strategy. And it's always been about empowering entrepreneurs. And initially that was around empowering entrepreneurs in emerging markets. And then as it got older, I wanted to back underrepresented founders, which is particularly women founders and founders of color in my home country, the US. As an African American and Native American woman, I saw the people in my community who were brilliant and could launch economy, life-changing, society-changing businesses not get the same access to opportunities. So I wanted to step up and do something about it. So a bit more about my background before we get into the first question that I'll pose to you all, which is, what is the new economy? I currently am an entrepreneur in residence with Oxford University. I also founded a network to democratize venture capital, mostly Black and brown angels and VCs. We deployed about 10 million across the US. And I'm also the gender advisor with Shell Foundation, which deploys about 20 to 40 million a year to startups and funds across Africa and Asia to revolutionize access to energy, transport, and agribusiness value chains. So as you can see, I've worked in all of these areas of using startups for good and business for good and trying to at the same time make our ecosystems more inclusive. And now we're at a paradigm shift. We're at a turning point potentially in the world's economic history. For years, people have been talking about the new economy. They started using this buzzword back in the 90s to describe the new high growth industries that were on the cutting edge of technology. And at the time, this was just going from a manufacturing economy to a services economy to going to a high-tech economy. Now that our society has become even more high-tech, people are referring to things like online retailers, crowdfunding, which is democratizing and disrupting the financial system, the sharing economy, whether that's your ride-hailing apps or your peer-to-peer lending of money or car sharing, obviously social media, which has disrupted all media, and then all kinds of online marketplaces, which can then disrupt whole industries. So that's, in recent years, what people have been saying when they refer to the new economy. And now I think all of that is in a stage of upheaval because of a few different transitions that I'm going to briefly mention that are converging at this moment when all of our economies, especially the UK economy, which we all know has a 20% drop in light of this post-COVID and post-lockdown, all of these transitions kind of frame the way economies will be going forward. So we've got the economic transition where there's higher returns to capital than to labor, which has created greater wealth inequality within countries and across countries. We've got tech that's enabling greater scale and automation than ever, but in many cases, which is also fomenting that inequality, because if you own the technology or the IP or the resources, you can get so much further, and you can also outsource labor. So we've got a world where globalization was accelerating for decades, and now for the first time, it's really hit major headwinds with trade barriers starting to go up because of populism in several countries and security risk in a few countries, and with COVID, where it's become harder than ever to travel for work or study. And for the first time, they're cutting things like the H-1B visa in the US. And you have a lockdown situation and a COVID situation, which has disrupted several sectors. And I don't mean disrupt in the tech sense. I mean, in terms of the destruction sense. And these are, on the top of mind are manufacturing, of course, entertainment, hospitality, which are more recent, and education, which is more recent. And it could end up being that the destruction in light of COVID could end up being what ends up being a creative destruction, which leads to a positive regeneration in the future. It's too early to see. So we have this economic transition that we're literally in the eye of the storm. We won't see what it'll look like in a few years. We also have, hand in hand, a demographic transition going on, which is, in the US is slated to become a majority minority country by 2040. Already at the level of primary school, it's a majority people of color. Likewise, Europe, which is one of the leading regions or blocks in terms of GDP, has also become increasingly heterogeneous for generations, especially in the leading cities, which are the economic hubs, and even more in the past few years because of waves of immigration due to refugee crises in various countries. You also have, in terms of demographic transitioning, an awakening. This awakening around gender started generations ago, but has accelerated in the past few years, linked to the Me Too movement, and the wave, the push, the uprising for racial equity has been really ratcheted up in the past few months due to the killing of George Floyd and the subsequent BLM uprisings across the world. So while we're having all of this economic transition and flux and rediscovery and trying to find new paths, we have these demographic factors that are shifting and which will influence the economy. And at the same time, we have an environmental transition. So this was already underway with the increase of climate change, but now we have pushback from governments, especially here in Europe, to mitigate climate change, to adhere to the COP treaties. We're not sure how much that's going to actually be maintained, as EU governments have to cut some of their commitments due to a GDP decrease, which is linked to COVID. But we know at the same time, the climate is continuing to change, temperatures are continuing to worsen, and the pressure from that is affecting, most of all, people of color in the global South and people of color who comprise the majority of under-resourced communities here in the West. So whether you're talking about in the US, where Black and brown communities are most the ones that are most destroyed by things like hurricanes, or most commonly victims of things like lead poisoning, to the fact that across Africa, farmers are having their incomes destroyed due to things like drought. So you have this ecological transition, which will then affect the economic and demographic transitions that I just mentioned. And then finally, just for further background, we have a a financial market transition. So more money than ever is going into venture capital. It's accelerated. Venture capital and private equity have got more money than ever over the past few years. We have more money into impact investment, which is when you invest for financial and social return alongside each other. Impact investment used to only receive about less than 20 billion a year around 2012. Now it's over 500 billion at the end of 2019, and it's likely to reach 20 trillion soon. In light of COVID, where the financial markets were rocked, we've seen more positive returns for ESG, which is basically impact investing. That's when you're investing to control for environmental, social, and governance risk. They're having the most positive returns, and they seem to be more crisis-proof than the regular S&P or the regular public markets. And then for a long time, we've had higher returns from private capital markets than public capital markets. So you have this massive flow of capital going on, the market's getting bigger and bigger and bigger. But how does it interact with a world where there's these demographic shifts and economic shifts and ecological shifts, where women and people of color can, seize these opportunities and reach economic equity, which we have not had for a really long time, or be wiped out even more and be further marginalized. The good news is that as we're shifting to more impactful business models, there's also a shift towards more inclusive business models. So these things go, hand in hand. When you look at the beginning of impact investing, it started with microfinance, which was basically saying that financial systems don't just have to be about serving the West and serving middle income people and serving companies. They can also serve low income Bangladeshi and Kenyan women who have their kiosk and have their rice paddies and have their micro enterprises. So that was part of reinventing financial markets. Obviously, with the growth of ESG and the growth of impact investing, this is a revolution. And this can all create a greater responsiveness to the unique challenges that I've just mentioned, the environmental, the demographic, and the economic challenges that I've just mentioned. They can all be addressed and should be addressed by impact investing. And so there's opportunities to invest in health tech, in ed tech, and cloud technologies, which help our economies recover from COVID, which help create jobs for those that need them most, which help give people access to healthcare and education in more inclusive and sustainable ways. We can impact invest in ways that are going to create more adaptability to the more polarized and more ecologically volatile and more decentralized world that we're living in. And I think impact investment has huge potential to ride this wave. So why are diverse founders important in doing so? Because of scale, competition, and market understanding. We need companies that can achieve massive market size with not too much competition, and where there's a unique market insight that can lead to a competitive advantage. And as you look at the growth of the private capital markets, where venture capital has grown and grown and grown, you see a glut where, more than 60% of the venture capital is flowing to the US. Within that, almost 90% is flowing to white male founders, and the majority of it is is flowing to founders from a few schools, namely Stanford and Harvard, and to a lesser extent Wharton, and the majority of it is flowing to only a few cities. So instead of the flow of capital that can be dispersed in ways that solve all of these challenges in unique ways, we're having it be saturated in a small segment of the population, whether that's geographically or demographically, which will only understand a sliver of the problems that we have to solve, which means that there's massive market sizes that are being neglected, and which means that there's potentially a lot of competition in the companies that are getting venture backed, as opposed to situations where you could have a massive market size and not too much competition. I'll give an example. One of my favorite companies is Babylon, and since we're here in the UK, I'm sure you're familiar. I believe it's one of the UK's first unicorns, billion-dollar company, providing telemedicine through the NHS and private healthcare. Now you have all of Africa, 1 billion people, almost no companies doing that. So if you can find a way to understand the governments, understand the insurance markets, have access to all medical care providers in Africa, this is a huge opportunity where there's going to be less competition than if you wanted to do another Babylon here in the UK, or God forbid, do another Babylon in USA and compete with tons of different companies. And what's interesting is because so much capital goes to the same place and the same subset of people, you have higher valuations, which could mean that investors would actually get better returns if they're going to the places and to the people that do not have the capital chasing them, and thus get more competitive valuations and higher returns when these companies do grow, leveraging their big market sizes and lesser competition. Another example is the gender example. We're half the population. We control 80% of household spending, yet we're less than 10% of VC-backed companies and of venture partners. So there's a plethora of products that women uniquely understand, but investors would not, most VC investors would not uniquely understand, whether that's, period panties or self-nursing bras. There's a lot of products that most investors don't understand, and it's an untapped market where you can have interesting upsides, interesting opportunities, loyal customers, and you need to leverage the unique knowledge of women founders to do that. And this generation of women, as we've seen highlighted through what's happened with COVID, will have the pressure that has not happened in previous generations, where with women being so strong in the workforce and waiting longer to have children, there's a pressure for child rearing and parental care or caregiving that will create unique needs, whether it comes to childcare. So that's an app like Bubble here in the UK, or welfare support or caring support like Wheel Life. That's another app out in the US, where unique business models can be created to tap captive markets, but you need to understand those markets. And that requires backing more women founders. And that requires having investors that understand women more, that understand people of color more, that understand Africa more, that understand all of these regions that are outside of, San Francisco and the core where most of the venture capital is flowing. And the challenge of this, of course, is the fact that we, people of color and women, have less primacy in private capital markets, in VC specifically, but in private capital markets in general. We are less represented in ICs, we're less represented across the board, and by extension, we're less represented in venture portfolios. And there's several factors that lead us to further get stuck, even when trying to get venture capital, beyond the fact that we're not often on the decision-making side as funders. There's things like the fact that in general, women and people of color, many of us have lower lifetime earnings, which means that we're less able to bootstrap our businesses to get to the point where it can get venture capital. For the case of women, we have higher household labor demands, which then makes it harder for us to be able to bootstrap and get to the same level. Of course, if you're looking at investing in Africa, there's foreign currency issues. So there's a variety of issues besides unconscious bias that has made it difficult traditionally to democratize private capital markets. But what is promising is that there's more funds, more attention than ever going to this issue. The number of gender lens funds went from less than 100 million about 5 or 6 years ago to over 2 billion in the past year. Several pledges for racial equity have come out in the past year, and now lots of LPs want to back Black GPs, want to back Black founders. There's a greater push. A consortium of over 100 investors came together to make a push for racial equity in the investment industry. So we are having an awakening in financial markets, as the financial markets have awoken to ESG, and that took about 2 decades. We're also having an awakening towards racial and gender equity and creating a financial market and a private capital market, which is more gender and racially inclusive, which actually represents us. And there will need to be changes to financial products in order for us to actually reach the apex of that, because it's not enough to just have more GPs or LPs and set quotas and target. You actually need to understand the unique needs of founders that are influenced by their gender and race, and create new financial products that respond to those differences. But overall, yes, we're in a period of immense transition economically, ecologically, demographically, politically, but we're also potentially in a paradigm shift from an old paradigm where social impact was for charity and finance was for commercial gain to a new wave, which has happened over the past 10 years, going from less than 20 billion to nearly a trillion. A new wave where impact investing shows a new way that you can have both commercial returns and social returns from an old paradigm where women and people of color were always on the margins, whether it refers to being considered property in the US, to being subjects of colonization, to being allowed to open a bank account without your husband's signature in many countries, which is still the case in a handful of countries. We're now shifting to resuming our rightful place, not just as subjects, but as leaders driving business, driving change, and driving capital. And this, to me, is what the new economy really represents. Thanks, Barbara.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tara. That was absolutely brilliant. And I'm sure that we'll soon start getting some questions coming in. But maybe I could start off with one where you talked about an awakening in financial markets towards racial and gender equity. So I was wondering if you could give a few more examples maybe of where you're seeing that happening, maybe in different countries, different approaches that are being taken. It'd be good to hear a little bit more about that while we're waiting for some questions.
Sure. So for example, Goldman Sachs. Look, okay, actually, I'll start with the data. So in the past 10 years, the evidence base for gender equality and financial returns started to get stronger and stronger. Oh, boards with an equal representation of women have, 19% better returns than those without representation of women. Companies where it's a gender equitable management team are performing better. And it may not be a huge differential, but it was, it was in the double-digit percentiles. It was enough where if you're talking about $1 billion company, it could be hundreds of millions. So that made people take notice, and it started actually with gender, and in some ways maybe gender is more palatable or easier for some people. And then the same data has been coming out with race, showing that companies with racially diverse leadership are performing about 30% better when it comes to returns. And I can't recall whether that's return on sales or returns on equities, but it was about 30% better returns for companies with diverse leadership. So it started there, and then you see a few commitments. So obviously I mentioned the number of gender lens funds has gone up to over 2 billion from 100 million in just a handful of years. But you also have things like Goldman Sachs launch with GS, which is all about trying to partner with startups and VCs and funders and the ecosystem to basically build a more, and they're actually, it seems to be taking a more racially focused, build a more diverse ecosystem. So that's a really interesting one because it's a bank that you don't associate with this kind of paradigm shift at all. But there's numerous private, smaller financial institutions, and by that I mean, the foundations and the family offices. In the past, basically after the BLM uprising started, over 100 of them came together to make a commitment to racial equity. Now, the definition of racial equity is still being defined. For gender, there's an existing paradigm, which is called gender lens investing, which kind of defines the ways that one would invest in order to empower women and lead to gender inclusive economies. For race, because race and gender are different, they work differently. That paradigm is still being created, but I hope that's a useful example.
Very good. Thank you very much for that. I don't want to take up any more time. Let's go to the first question, which is from Manoj. He says, "Hi, Tara. The rest of the world sees Africa and alike nations from a diluted lens. There is so much creative potential to create impact investment, yet why do you think people and businesses are still slow to invest? Is this our own unconscious and subconscious bias?"
It could be. It could be. There's a few angles to that. part of it is because Africa is so diverse. It's, 54 countries, each with their own legal frameworks and languages. I know for many of the countries, let's include especially like Francophone Africa, Lusophone Africa, the legal framework is so different for that it makes it harder for, the Anglophone world to want to invest there. Obviously, unconscious bias can play a role, but the amount of capital flowing to Africa has been increasing for years. It's just been increasing in a few core economies. So about 90% of the investment to Africa goes to about 10 companies. And when I say investment, I'm referring to private investment, not linked to the government. So things like VC. And those countries they're the old suspects: South Africa, Kenya, Nigeria, Tanzania, Uganda, Ghana. It's a few countries. So I would argue that there is investment going into Africa. There's a subset of investors for which Africa is a focus, but there's still the majority of countries being neglected. And part of that is because language, legal frameworks, corruption, and the broader ecosystem that would enable a business to thrive. So it's starting from a lower base, and it's much harder. But then once again, once you go there, you can have a much higher upside if you're willing to eat all of those risks. But considering where a lot of the capital in the West comes from, when we're talking about institutional investors that get their money from pension funds, or even the CDC, which is the UK government's private equity arm, you have a governmental imperative, because this is taxpayer money, or this is pensioners' money. So you can't take the risk in a country, let's say like Mauritania. You have to go to a safer country like South Africa. So there's not one answer. It's multi-layered, but I hope I shedded some light on some of the layers.
Thank you very much for that, Tara. Manoj, if you want to come back on that, just pop something in the chat. In the meantime, I'll go on to Bipin. And Bipin says, on the racial diversity landscape, I believe that more Asians have benefited from this agenda. What should we be looking at to ensure great equality even amongst our own BAME?
That's really interesting. You're not the first person to make that remark. I'm not a UK national. I know in the US, for example, in some universities where they're making allocations or giving preferences to people of color, Asians are excluded, because the idea is we need to address underrepresentation, and the underrepresentation has not affected the Asians for these particular issues. I certainly believe that there are some issues where Asians have the same barriers as other BAME people, but I guess the representation issue is affecting us all differently, and we need to take that into consideration. In regards to what the Asian contingent of the BAME delegation can do, I would say that we all really need to be allies to each other, and we all really need to support each other, because the discrimination that you could be unscathed from that affects another person, you could also just as easily be on the other side of. Mm-hmm. So consider that person your brother or sister, even if it's not even if that issue is not affecting you directly. Fight for all of us to get the access to the opportunities, to get the access to the investment. If you would want people to fight for you if the shoe were on the other foot.
Absolutely. And I think because we're running out of time, that Bipin, that also answers your other question, which was about what do you feel we need to learn or share to become better masters of our own destiny? I think what you have just said, Tara, really goes towards that. And of course, that's very much what MSD UK and our other organizations around the world that we work with in the GSDA Alliance are all about, that wider understanding of diversity in terms of race. And that's why we specifically use the term ethnic minority businesses rather than BAME businesses, because I think people don't get the understanding of the breadth and the inclusivity of what we do at MSD UK to work with all businesses, all entrepreneurs of colour, and not just a few select people. So I think that your final comment there about, you know, let's fight for each other and stand up for each other and support each other is very, very pertinent to the context that we're in. And as I say, I think very much addresses Bipin's last question. Now, thank you for the answer. This is from Manoj. Thank you for answering my question. Good to know that there is investment, albeit to a select few countries. Yes, the legal framework does play a big part. I was born in Mombasa, Kenya. So he definitely understands that context. Well, we're just about there on time, but I'd very much like to give you the final word, Tara, if there is anything else you wanted to say just before we finish.
I just wanted to thank you all for welcoming me for today's talk. I hope you all, in spite of all of the upheaval around us, feel optimism about the new economy that we can create together, and not just optimism, but boldness in creating it.
Thank you very much for that. That was an excellent power talk today. Thank you all for attending, and we shall see you all later. Thank you so much. Bye-bye. Thank you, Tara.